You are currently here, sitting in front of your screen. And if, like me, you live in an apartment, then at most, you're only about 10 meters away from your closest neighbor, a charming and music-loving person who enjoys playing with a hammer on Sunday mornings. When suddenly you feel an irresistible urge to escape the proximity of your fellow humans, to go isolate yourself as far away as possible. Okay, getting out is the first step, but where to go? So what are the most inaccessible and remote places from any human presence on our planet? To answer, let's first find places where no one lives, since humans are unevenly spread on Earth. As shown on this map, 5% of the world's population lives in this small red area. That's as many as in all the blue areas combined. In these vast territories, you can find areas nearly devoid of people, like Esmer Island. Located in the Canadian Arctic archipelago, this territory is as large as Senegal. But the latter has 15 million people, while this island has 146. If you stood here, in the north, you would be 1,600 kilometers as the crow flies from your nearest neighbor. Because all the inhabitants of the island live in the far south, in the small town of Grisfjord. Except yes, there are still humans there. In fact, if you want a really big rock all to yourself, you can choose Vaughn's Island. A top destination for a moment of solitude, since it's the largest island in the world that is completely uninhabited. Here, just for you, an area comparable to that of Croatia and no one to ruin your life. The only downside is uninhabited doesn't always mean inaccessible. Now you're just a few hundred kilometers from Gryffindor or the small town of Resolute, which has 229 residents. If you want total solitude, it's best to go to the southern pole of inaccessibility. The point farthest from any coast on the 6th continent. Coming here is a tribute to solitude, because the nearest coasts are about 1,300 kilometers away. The South Pole Research Station is 878 kilometers away, Vostok Station is 1,000 kilometers away. To give you an idea of the distance separating you from these bases, here is the size of France to scale. As far as you can see, a vast, windswept ice expanse stretches out, empty of inhabitants. Enough to let you be on bad terms with neighbors. Especially since the temperatures here are the lowest you can find on Earth, with an average of minus 58 degrees. Yet there is a Soviet research base there. Abandoned for almost 60 years, it now lies buried in snow, with only a bust of Lenin facing Moscow visible. Though it's hard to imagine a more hostile place, even more remote and uninhabited land exists farther from humans. Just go to Bouvet Island in the South Atlantic Ocean. Almost entirely covered by a glacier, this uninhabited island of about 50 square kilometers is located some 1,700 kilometers from the Antarctic coast, and 1,845 from Tristan da Cunha, the world's most isolated archipelago. Here is France to scale, showing the vast distances from this island chain to St. Helena, about 2,400 kilometers away, and the African coast, 2,800 kilometers away. However, this archipelago's 267 inhabitants undermine our quest for absolute solitude, who therefore live in the most remote place you can find on dry land. The spot farthest from humans on Earth isn't on land, but in the ocean. It's called Point Nemo. Known as the Oceanic pole of inaccessibility, it's the world's most isolated spot, farthest from any land. If you were here on a hypothetical boat in the middle of the vast South Pacific Ocean, you would be 2,688 kilometers from the nearest island. A small, uninhabited, 4 square kilometer atoll at equal distances from Easter Island's 6,000 residents and Antarctica. Standing at Point Nemo puts you at the center of a 22 million square kilometer area with no land. In this space, where nothing stands out, you could fit France 30 times over. Because all around you, everywhere, beyond the horizon, the blue planet truly lives up to its name. If you have a mechanical failure, you should rely on yourself, since except for a few Vendée Globe sailors, hardly anyone passes through here, as shown by this map of global maritime traffic routes over the course of a year. Here, it's better to be in good company with yourself. In fact, Point Nemo is so far from the rest of the world that if you were there, the closest people to you wouldn't be on Earth, but in the sky and in space. They would be the passengers of Qantas Flight 28, which connects Santiago to Sydney and whose route passes about 1,000 kilometers south of your position. Most importantly, the astronauts on the International Space Station, who at times would be closer to you than anyone else on Earth, because the station's orbit would occasionally pass about 400 kilometers above your head. The waters around Point Nemo are so rarely visited by humans that they're often used to bring down satellites and spacecraft at the end of their lifespans, such as the Soviet station Mir, which crashed there in 2001, Point Nemo is the most remote spot from any human presence for isolation. And to some extent, you could say that no one has ever stood more than 2,700 kilometers from another person. The distance between Point Nemo and Easter Island? Actually, not quite. During the Apollo missions, command module pilots, who remained alone in lunar orbit while their 2 crewmates explored the moon, were even farther from any other human. Because as their spacecraft passed over the far side of our satellite, they were over 3,500 kilometers from their colleagues and more than 350,000 kilometers from all other humans. And this with no radio communication while on the far side of the moon, completely isolated from the world. But the strangest thing about all this is perhaps that you'll never really be very far from your neighbor, at least in terms of travel time. Because in the time we live in, from any major city in the world and with enough financial means, it would take your neighbor barely 8 days to find you if you were in Tristan da Cunha, which doesn't have an airport. And about 20 days if you were at Point Nemo. As for the abandoned station at the South Pole, it would be within flying distance for him from the military bases. A century earlier, Amundsen spent almost 2 months walking from the coast to the South Pole, not including the weeks by boat from Europe to the frozen continent. Here is a map from 1914 which shows the travel time needed to cover the distance from London to another point on the globe. This map is known as an isochrone map. You can see that a century ago, it took less than 5 days of travel from London to get to Moscow, Algiers, or Istanbul. To reach the west coast of the United States or India, it took 10 to 20 days and more than 40 days to get to the center of Africa, Latin America, or Australia. Here's the updated map with 2015 travel times. Shown in dark red from London are areas reachable in half a day. Travel times have shrunk, and most of the world can now be reached in 2 to 3 days of non-stop travel. Our world is still just as vast, but it has shrunk considerably. So it would be better to get a little closer and learn to live with your neighbor. The one who uses a hammer in the morning. So that we can make a living from it and dedicate ourselves to it full time, this channel needs your support. You can support us on Typee or Utip or follow us on Twitter, Facebook or Instagram.